Good morning. Time now 8 a.m. On Friday, April 28th, 2023 in Japan Standard Time. Welcome back to the another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize a series of morning seminars to feature the latest edition of the World Bank report by having our economists and the specialists as a speaker in our programs. Every spring and the fall, we feature the regional economic update put together by respective chief economist offices from all the regions. We have already done several regions for this semester. Today, this morning, we are featuring the Middle East and North Africa version of it. Middle East and North Africa Economic Update Spring 2023 edition was released on April 6, about 3 weeks ago, subtitled Altered Destinies, the long-term effect of the rising prices and food insecurity in the Middle East and North Africa. With us this morning, we have two economists from the team put together this report. Let me very briefly introduce each one of them. First, we have Asif Mohammed Islam, who is the senior economist from the Office of the Regional Economist for the Middle East and North Africa. Good morning, Asif. Good evening to you, actually. Can you hear me?
Yes, good morning.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us. And also we have Federico Roberto Bennett, who is the economist in the same Office of the Chief Economist for the North Africa, Middle East and North Africa regions. Good evening, good morning to you, Fed. Thanks for joining.
Morning. Thank you for having us.
Super. Great. Thank you. So as usual, we are going to listen to both Asif and Fede to present the main point of the report. Probably they will speak about 20-25 minutes. After their presentation, I'll read the questions that we received already from you in advance. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, as usual, please do so even during the seminar by using the online form posted on the announcement page of this seminar, or you can simply go ahead and post your question on the chat screen on the YouTube page, and then I will read your questions after their presentations, then ask them, the speakers, to respond to you. With that, I would like to ask Asif and Fede to formally come in to kick off the presentation. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to present the MENA Economic Update. My name is Asif Islam. I'm a senior economist at the MENA Chief Economist Office, and I'll be presenting together with my colleague, Federico Bennett. So our title for the MENA Economic Update is Altered Destinies, as Koichi mentioned, and it's on the long-term effects of rising prices and food insecurity in the Middle East and North Africa region. I would like to thank my team for all their excellent work in getting this report together, and also especially like to thank our Chief Economist, Roberto Gatti, and our Deputy Chief Economist, Daniel Letterman, for all their guidance throughout. So our updates are usually divided into two parts. First, you have a macroeconomic update, and then you have a thematic chapter. The thematic chapter this time is on the long-term effects of food insecurity. Over here, what I'll do is I'll give you the key messages for the full report. So what we see in the MENA region is that growth rate will slow down in 2023 after the oil windfall of 2022 that benefited largely GCC economies. So GDP growth from MENA will decline from about 5.8% in 2022 to a forecast of 3% in 2023. This is largely due to the Gulf countries, the GCC economies, where growth was 7.3% in 2022, and it'll fall to 3.2% in 2023. This is against the backdrop of high inflation. The region's inflation rate rose dramatically in 2022, and food inflation rose even faster. Between March and December 2022, food inflation year-on-year was 29%, while headline inflation year-on-year was 19.4%. A key message of this report is that rising food prices, even if they are temporary, pose severe challenges for the MENA region, and this may last for generations. And this new challenge compounds on already inadequate child nutrition and health pre-COVID-19 pandemic And we do have dated data on this. We also look at the present and we see the state of food insecurity. We see that it has deteriorated from about 11.8% of the population being severely food insecure in 2006 to about 17.6% in 2023. And this is largely due to the situation in Syria and Yemen. One main message we have is that we must act now. The cost of inaction compounded over many future generations will be much higher. And there are a range of policies we discuss. We discuss better target cash and in-kind transfers, the importance of resilient food systems, better care from mothers, and improved data. So I'll now hand it to my colleague Fede, who will go through part 1 of the report on the macroeconomic developments and outlook.
Thank you very much, Asif. So to kick off the macroeconomic outlook for the MENA region in this report, we're going to talk about growth. On the left-hand side here, you can see the cumulative growth of the MENA region as a whole, represented in the red dark line, compared to the rest of the world in the yellow, between the years 2021 and the forecasts up to 2024. Now, the first thing that you can see is that, as Asif mentioned, in 2022, the MENA region as a whole grew extraordinarily fast compared to the rest of the world. Although this has going to experience a sharp deceleration moving on to 2023, going from 5.8% growth in 2022 to 3% growth in 2023. On the right-hand side, however, we see that this regional average masks some heterogeneity. And so across different subgroups within the region, we see that, as Asif mentioned, the GCC are the subgroup that is going to grow the fastest, here represented by the dark brown line at the top of the graph. The developing oil exporters in blue and developing oil importers in the light brown have experienced much lower growth in 2022 and are also experiencing lower growth in 2023, just like the GCC. Now, the GCC is the country that grew the fastest in 2022, the country group that grew the fastest in 2022, but is also experiencing the largest deceleration from 7.3% to 3.2%. Now, you'll notice that we have set Egypt aside here because it represents a little bit of an outlier in terms of compared to other oil importers with much higher growth in 2022 and indeed higher projected growth into 2023. Although I must say that this forecast for Egypt is surrounded by significant uncertainty, with private sector forecasts ranging from between 2% to 4.5%. Now, we use and leverage the high frequency of private sector forecasts to document how forecasts evolved since February 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine occurred. Indeed, we see that the division in terms of the forecast revisions were divided across oil lines. The graphs on this slide show the change in the forecast for growth in 2022 on the left-hand side and 23 on the right-hand side, with respect to what the forecast was in February 22. So a plus 1% on this graph represents an upward revision of the forecast by 1%. On the left-hand side, we can see that GCC and developing oil exporters in yellow and blue respectively, their forecasts were revised upwards after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and remained at a higher level throughout in the 12 months after. On the other hand, we have that developing oil importers' forecasts were revised downwards over the same period. On the right-hand side, we see that then when making forecasts for this year, our current year, 2023, the forecasts were revised along similar lines, with oil exporters being revised upwards and oil importers being revised downwards. And that is true up until October in 2022, where it became clear that the oil prices or the oil windfalls were unwinding faster than previously anticipated. And indeed, the forecast for GCC and developing oil exporters were revised back downwards. Now, when it comes to inflation, we also see a heterogeneous region in terms of the level of inflation. What you see in this graph here is for 16 MENA economies. you see what the average year-on-year inflation was between October 2021 and February 2022. That is the post-pandemic, if you will, period before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we see that indeed there is a lot of heterogeneity within the region. I must note that on the right-hand side, we have Iran and Lebanon that are displayed on a different scale due to their much higher levels of inflation with respect to the rest of the countries. Now, after February 2022, between March and December 2022, the average year-on-year inflation is represented by the yellow bars here. And we can see that across these 16 MENA countries, almost without exception, inflation rose. And we see that on average, excluding Iran and Lebanon, it rose from 5.7% to 9.4%. So significant increase. And we see that in some of these countries, the increase was also much higher than that. Now, it so happens, and we document this in the report, that a significant part of this increase in prices comes from fluctuations in the exchange rate through the price of tradable goods. After we adjust the price of tradable goods for the experienced depreciation in some of these countries, we obtain what we're representing here in the blue bars, which is the exchange rate adjusted inflation. And we can see that in some countries such as Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and the Palestine territories, we said indeed the exchange rate fluctuations accounted for a large fraction of headline inflation. Now, one of the product groups that are tradables that we focus on in this report is food products. And when it comes to the increase in food products, that is food inflation, we see a similar pattern where since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, food prices rose, in some cases quite dramatically in the countries in the region. Now, one thing that you cannot see from this specific graph, but we'll show you in the next slide, is that food inflation was indeed much higher than headline inflation in almost all of the considered countries. Here you have food inflation on the vertical axis and headline inflation on the horizontal, with a dashed diagonal line representing the 45-degree line. We see that most countries are above this line, indicating that food inflation was higher than headline inflation for all countries considered except for Jordan and Qatar. In some cases, such as Egypt, Djibouti, Morocco, Bahrain, we see that indeed the difference was quite large. Now, why do we care about food inflation in particular? Well, it so happens that the poorest households spend a larger share of their budget on food products. And so whenever food prices increase by a lot, they are disproportionately affected by this. To quantify this, we used survey data in developing MENA economies to construct a consumer price index that was specific to the poorest households and a different consumer price index that was specific to the richest households. And we used these different consumer price indices to calculate what the inflation that these different groups were exposed to was. And what we find, as you might suspect, is that the poorest were exposed to higher levels of inflation than the richest households. Indeed, in December 2022, on average across developing MENA, the poor were experienced 2 percentage points higher inflation than their richer counterparts. Now, why do we care about this? Well, aside from the obvious reasons that the poor and the most vulnerable might be disproportionately affected, it happens that the food insecurity that might come from exposure to high food prices can have very long-lasting effects. And so that bridges into the thematic part of our report, which will discuss the long-term effects of food insecurity in the MENA region. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Asif. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fede. So the second part of our report is on the lasting impact of food insecurity. And here I'll run down what the main messages are of part 2. First, food price inflation is not just an immediate concern. It's important because it has effects on children, on babies in utero. The first 1,000 days are important for a child's physical and brain development. Malnutrition in utero and early childhood can increase the risk of stunting, and this is well noted in the literature. And this can have lasting negative effects on health, education, and income outcomes well into adulthood. And what we also see is that some studies find that it's also the children of these adults that get affected. So these effects can be intergenerational. So what do we do in terms of the region? We explore and see, what we can map out and what happened after the 4 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where we saw a lot of increase in food inflation. So we look at the literature and we see what estimates they are, and we take one of the more conservative estimates to see what the effect of a percentage point increase in food inflation is at the risk of under 5 stunting. From this, what we find is that exposure to food inflation between March of 2022 to June of 2022 had different effects depending on the counterfactual we chose. And we looked at 3 counterfactual. The first counterfactual was the average for 2019, the average food inflation for 2019, which is essentially pre-pandemic. The second counterfactual we took was the average for 2021, which is essentially post-pandemic. And the last counterfactual we took was 4 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Taking all these counterfactuals together, we see that essentially the increase in month-to-month food prices between March and June 2022 may have resulted in the risk of stunting, an increase in the risk of stunting by about 17 to 24%, and this translates to about 200,000 to 285,000 children who have been born with the risk of stunting. This, of course, as the literature has shown, has effects on schooling and also performance in terms of test scores. And what we see is this might have led to about a 3 weeks to a month reduction in schooling and about a 0.5 to 0.8% drop in test scores. Of course, this can then play out to lower outcomes well into adulthood, as we explained and the literature has shown. But it's important to note that, children play a large part of this story, and child health and nutrition in MENA was already inadequate pre-pandemic. Over here, what we have on the y-axis is the percentage of children under 5 stunted. On the x-axis we have is the level of development. Not surprisingly, what you see here is that richer countries tend to have lower levels of childhood stunting. However, there are a few other things we know from this graph. One is that for many MENA countries, they tend to have higher rates of stunting than their income peers. We see very high rates in Yemen, Syria, and Libya, and this is dated before the conflicts in these countries. We also see that even in the richer MENA economies that tend to have lower stunting rates, but also they tend to perform worse than their income peers. Now, this could be because of dated data in, let's say, Bahrain and Qatar, which is from 1995, but even where we have more recent data, like in Oman and Kuwait, which is from 2017, we see this pattern seems to hold. Note that over here, we only use survey estimates. So this gives you an indication of how dated these surveys are. Now, of course, these averages don't tell you the full story. So over here, what we do is we show the prevalence of stunting by wealth quintile. We have the first quintile, which is the poorest, and then we have the 5th quintile, which is the richest. And you can see a rich-poor gap in stunting across households in many of the MENA economies. In fact, in some cases, when you look at the first quintile, which is the poorest, and the second quintile, which is the second poorest group, you see a meaningful difference in the gap in stunting rates. Yemen, Syria, and Libya are on a different scale because they have very high stunting rates, and so they're presented in panel B to the right-hand side. Another aspect we look at is children dietary diversity. When you have rising food prices, it could alter the composition of the diet as different foods become relatively less or more expensive. So what we do here is we look at a measure of children dietary diversity, which is the minimum dietary diversity. This is essentially the percentage of children from 6 to 23 months of age who consumed foods and beverages from at least 5 out of 8 defined food groups. And we essentially plot this against the level of income. And what you see, not surprisingly, is that richer countries tend to have better children dietary diversity than poorer countries. However, you also see that only 2 out of the 7 MENA economies in the sample tend to perform better than their income peers. And this speaks to one of the narratives we have, is that we do have the prevalence of food subsidies in the MENA region, and these subsidies do not necessarily target the most nutritious food. So they may distort the diets that these children and these families face, and this could lead to worsening health outcomes. And this leads to a pattern we observe in MENA and even many developing economies is what they call the double burden of malnutrition. You have undernutrition in one hand side coexisting with obesity and overweightedness. Now, one last thing I do want to say about child health and nutrition is the lack of data. So what we see is, yes, there is data for child malnutrition and health in the MENA region, but it tends to be very dated. So when you look at Mexico, for instance, their last survey was in 2020. And if you decide to go 5 years previous then to 2015, and you see how many MENA countries have a survey since then, it's only 11 out of 19 economies. So essentially, a lot of the policymakers are flying blind. There's still a lot we don't know about the state of child health and nutrition post-pandemic. So far, I've showed you the long-term effects and how it's been, shown in the literature to matter for food insecurity. And I showed you how child health and nutrition is already inadequate in the MENA region. Now we turn to the present and see, okay, what's the state of food insecurity right now? So we take data from the FAO and we combine this with latest machine learning techniques, and we come up with some estimates. And we see that in MENA, at least the developing MENA economies, that the food insecurity situation has deteriorated from about 11.8% in 2006 of population was severely food insecure, and this went to 17.6% forecasted for 2023. And this is largely due to the situation in Syria and Yemen that are food insecurity hotspots. To the graph to your left, what you have is each MENA economy put in their income bracket and the average food insecurity for each income bracket as noted by the dashed black lines. So not surprisingly, Syria and Yemen have higher food insecurity rates, severe food insecurity rates than their income peers. But what's also interesting is that the upper middle income countries and the GCC economies tend to have worse food insecurity rates than their income peers. In our estimates, if you look at the developing MENA region, we see that in 2023, 8 million children in the region may be food insecure. Now, this may be a conservative estimate because of the fact that this assumes poorer households and richer households have the same number of children. When we decompose the severe food insecurity to various elements, we see that inflation may have contributed about 24 to 33% to the forecast of food insecurity in 2023. So what can we do about it? Well, we need to act now. The cost of inaction compounded over many future generations will be much, much higher. And there's a certain range of policy options that we discuss in the report. We, of course, don't go fully into details because a lot of them, you would put a lot of attention to them and you could talk a lot more about the details of them. And we have several others work ongoing regarding them. So first, better targeted cash and in-kind transfers are very important and useful for extremely urgent situations of acute food insecurity. Second, we see that mothers play a very important role in this narrative. We know that children in utero, babies in utero and children, that when they are affected, this leads to long-term effects. And so the state of mothers is very important, and protecting mothers is one of the policy recommendations. This can come in the form of maternity leave, the availability, affordability, and quality of childcare, as well as maternal education. In terms of the supply side, building resilient food systems is important to absorb some of the shocks. And finally, in terms of dated household surveys increase the challenges to assess child health and nutrition in the region, and also hinders having better and well-targeted policy. So I stop here right now. Thank you very much for your time, and we welcome any questions you have.
Thank you very much, Asif and Fede, for summarizing the main findings of the latest edition of the Middle East and North Africa Economic Update. Thank you very much. We received several questions from the audience. So let me start reading those questions. In fact, the questions, the 3 questions came from the same person. Thank you for sending those questions. The questions from Sasaki-san. Thank you. Let me read the first one. Please mention on the impact on the private sector in the region, both local domestic companies as well as the foreign direct investment from outside the countries in the current challenging situations in the MENA regions. Any comment, Asif, of Fed, please? Thanks.
So thank you very much for that question. So we do not really cover the private sector in this report. We know the private sector is important. We do have other reports that look into the challenges of the private sector and so forth. We have recently a report on unlocking sustainable private sector growth in the Middle East and North Africa, together with the European Investment Bank and the EBRD, that looks at the challenges of the private sector and so forth. It's something we don't cover, but yes, we agree it is very important.
Sorry, I was unmuted. So thank you very much for your responses. Let me continue. Let me continue read a question from the same person. The final slide is calling for immediate actions. And how is the World Bank taking actual actions, helping MENA government and political leadership in the region really understand the importance of these issues and take action themselves? Any comment, please?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So the World Bank has responded to the urgent food insecurity crisis in MENA through many of its emergency operations throughout the region, and this involves countries including Egypt, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Djibouti. And this is a lot of the great work done by our colleagues. And this is important in terms of thinking about urgent situations. But I would like to come back and say that when you think about the long-term effects of food insecurity, you have to think in a much more broader lens, right? As the policy mentions, you have to think about the mothers and how they're affected. You have to think about food systems and how they could be better in many ways. And more importantly, you have to also think about what you know and what you don't know. And this is where the data angle is very, very important. And having a good idea of the state of the situation really helps policymakers move forward.
Thank you for your responses. Let me continue read the third question from the same person. On data, any concrete actions the World Bank is taking in order to help the MENA government to build the capacity on the data and the surveys?
That's an excellent question. So the data agenda is very important for the office. We understand that MENA is a data desert. There's a lot of information that we have gathered that analyzes the data systems in the MENA region, and definitely a lot more could be done. In April 2020, we wrote how data transparency could help the MENA region. It was one of our economic updates, and we dived into the several aspects, the importance, and we tried to show how MENA has been lagging in a lot of the statistical indicators. And it's an important agenda to try and make sure that we have better data systems. You also know there's been a World Development Report on data that previously came out very recently, and that discussed a lot on the policy that we implemented that could improve the data systems in MENA. And even in our last update on a new state of mind, we discussed the importance of data, and we highlighted in many cases, where data has been lacking and so forth. In some of the estimates I've seen, some of the indicators of statistical capacity index, developing MENA countries have been, have seen a sharp decline in data systems over the last 10 years or so. So it's an important agenda that we've been working on, and we've highlighted consistently that there's a lot more, we can do in this, and we need this data. It's very urgent to get a sense of what's going on in the MENA region. As we highlighted, the 11 out of 19 economies having good survey data from 2015, it's pretty dated. It goes far back, and we need to take action now. So we need this data to also help us and better target the policies going forward.
Thank you for your responses. I have one question related to the slide 17 that you showed the prevalence of the severe food insecure people in MENA region, and then this graph shows Syria and Yemen are the food insecurity hotspot. But also on the same slide, you mentioned that nearly 8 million children in the region may be food insecure, and you also said that this may be rather conservative numbers. Now, apparently, I would imagine that of nearly 8 million children, many of them being in the Syria and the Yemen, But also in terms of the other countries in the lower middle income or upper middle income countries in the MENA regions, how do you say about those children facing with food insecure in other countries other than Syria and Yemen? Any comments, please?
You seem to be muted.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So I don't have these numbers with me, but yes, Syria and Yemen are at least 50% of the calculation that we have here, and they contribute a considerable amount to this figure. But that's, that does not mean it's insignificant for the other countries as well. They do have, especially the middle income countries, have a large contribution to this number that we have of 8 million. It's not just all Syria and Yemen. But thank you. That's a very good question and to clarify.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm double checking if we received questions from the audience. Probably we didn't receive any other questions. So probably before wrapping up the seminar, I'll ask Asif and Fed to say a very final words to the audience in Japan, and then we wrap up a seminar. So Asif, Fed, please go ahead for your final words.
Thank you, Koichi. So I'll go first and I'll let Fede take. So just to remember our main messages of this report, it's quite important. The growth has been slowing down in the MENA region. It's against a background of high inflation. Food inflation has been going up even faster, and this has long-run effects. It's not just about the immediate concerns, which are important and devastating, but this has long-term effects. And we need to think far into the future about what this means and how it is important to act now. Thank you, everyone. Fede, please.
Yes, and maybe just one final thought is that one of the things that distinguishes this report is the fact that it puts a human face to the economic numbers that we often look at. It affects people's lives, and behind this, it affects the futures of today's children. And so this is definitely something that we should keep in mind when thinking about the economic impact on actual people's lives and futures. So yeah, thank you very much for having us, and thank you, Koichi.
Great, thank you. We had a pleasure of having two economists from the Office of the Chief Economist for Middle East and North Africa region of the World Bank. We had Asif Islam, and also we had Federico Bennett joining us from Washington, D.C. this morning. Thank you very much, both of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Great, thank you. We'll take the 1 week break next week following Japan's tradition of Golden Week long holidays. But we'll return after the Golden Week and with the two seminars. One is the May 10th, I think. Yes, May 10th. We are going to feature the Africa's Pulse, which is the Africa version of the Regional Economic Update. And also May 11th, we are going to feature the latest edition of the Commodity Market Outlook. So these will start at 8 a.m. On Japan Standard Time. And also, those of you who happen to be in the Sapporo area for the next 1 month, we are going to start the photo exhibit of the photos taken by Dorte Werner, who is one of our economists, who was actually the frequent speakers in our programs in the past. Her photos on Africa will be shown at the JICA Sapporo or JICA Hokkaido in Sapporo for the next 1 month, starting tomorrow. So please, if you have opportunities to visit the Sapporo area, stop by in JICA Hokkaido to appreciate and enjoy the photos of Africa taken by our economist, Dorte Werner. So with that, once again, thank you very much for tuning in. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time. on our seminar. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Asif and Federico. This is the end of the seminar. Thanks.
Thank you, Koichi. Very nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.